Hello, this is Dave Hurwitz, Executive Editor at ClassicsToday.com, here to talk to you about Paul Hindemith's beautiful symphony, Mathis der Maler. Now, this is probably his most popular orchestral work, along with the symphonic metamorphosis of themes by Weber. It used to be played all the time. It's not played so much anymore. Hindemith's reputation seems to be a little bit in the doldrums, as far as recordings go anyway, and it's really a shame. Now, I have a very, very strong connection to this particular work because it was the subject of my first master's thesis when I was at Johns Hopkins University, but I did my research at the Yale School of Music, where they have the Hindemith archives. And it's a fascinating, fascinating story. I'd like to take a moment and tell you a little bit about it because I think it'll interest you very much. Now, as you may know, the Hindemith Symphony was taken from the opera of the same title, Mathis the Painter, which is about the trials and tribulations of Matthias Grunwald, who painted the Isenheim altarpiece. And each of the movements is an illustration of one of the panels from the altarpiece. It begins with the Concert of Angels, in which three angels are zipping around and singing and playing musical instruments. Then there's the Entombment of Christ, and finally the Temptation of St. Anthony, concluding with an Alleluia, which is the scene from the dream vision section of the opera. The story concerns Mathis's attempt to try and create art in a time of great social turmoil, the peasant rebellions of the 16th century. Now, the story was obviously conceived as an allegory about Hindemith's own experiences in Nazi Germany, which were not going well. He continued to concertize with Jewish musicians. He wrote music in a style that was considered shocking and anti-fascist and modernist. And in writing Mathis der Maler, he was not exactly pandering to the regime. What he tried to do, and what happened to him, is that after a lot of thought, he very naturally and honestly, and I think with a great deal of integrity, began to believe in the social responsibility of the artist. And so his style became more approachable, compared to, for example, his earlier opera, Cardiac, about, the jeweler who runs around killing people to steal back his jewels. It's a great piece, but it's written in a very harsh, neoclassical chromatic idiom with a large woodwind section and not so much strings. It's completely anti-romantic, anti-sentimental, as Hindemith largely was no matter what. Mathis der Maler is totally different. Mathis uses German folk songs. The idiom is far more tonally normal, although it has plenty of Hindemith's own sort of quartal, fourth-based harmony. And he really intended the piece to represent his great reconciliation with the German people and German society, and he very, very idealistically, and foolishly as it turned out, looked forward to the dawn of sort of a new era in German art, led, of course, by himself, and it didn't work out that way. What happened was, because he was caught on the radio making some disparaging remarks about the regime, his music was largely banned. And at the same time, this was about 1938, he was working on the opera and trying to get a premiere going, and he extracted the symphony as an example of his new style, and Furtwängler programmed it. And he programmed it and published a very, very important statement called Der Fall Hindemith, the Hindemith case, in which he made the argument that art must remain free of political interference. Now, the premiere of Mathis der Maler was enormously successful, the symphony. And Hitler and Goebbels were horrified and appalled that this challenge to what they perceived as the challenge to their regime was receiving a lot of public support and acclaim. As a result of this, Hindemith's music was banned entirely. He wound up fleeing Germany entirely. Before the war, he went first to Switzerland and then to Turkey, and then, as we all know, to the United States, where he wound up at Yale and for a good period of time before moving back to Switzerland. He never returned to Germany to live. He worked there. He had concerts, obviously. He did things. He made some recordings we'll talk about in a moment. But he never forgave Germany for essentially ostracizing him during that period and for what happened during the Nazi period. Furtwängler, of course, resigned all of his posts in protest at what was going on. And then, of course, as we know, capitulated entirely and took up his posts again, not necessarily the same ones, but resumed work with the Berlin Philharmonic and remained in Germany throughout the war as the guardian of what he regarded as high German culture, and what his detractors, among whom I am one for this decision, regard as nothing more than a narcissistic, egomaniacal capitulation to the Nazi regime for his own purposes, because everyone else had fled, basically. Everyone else who was anyone else of his eminence left. Of course, it's more complicated than just that, but that's the bottom line. That's basically what happened. Anyway, the symphony itself is in 3 movements, as I said. It's absolutely beautiful. It's been recorded many, many times. And the first recording that I'd like to discuss was Hindemith's own. Now, Hindemith's own. Now, Hindemith was, by and large, a really bad conductor. He was a stiff, inefficient, stodgy, actually kind of like some of his less interesting music is. And this set, though, is important. It's important to hear his way with the piece. And I think that, the performance of Mathis is pretty good. It really is. But the important thing to note about it is that it completely avoids that jogging, stiff effect in the finale, where it just goes dump, ba-dump, 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 endlessly. Those are what the worst performances do. For example, Jascha Horenstein's famous recording on Unicorn that was coupled with Strauss's Death and Transfiguration. Remember that? It's fine for the first 2 movements, but after that we get the classic Horenstein stiffness where he cannot vary the pulse, and it just chugs along monotonously. It's just awful. And, that's the thing you have to be aware of. Other than that, the piece doesn't offer that many interpretive problems. I mean, capturing the freedom of the string recitatives at the beginning of the finale and getting the Alleluia at the very end right. And there are a couple other moments that may be a little tricky. But other than that, the piece really more or less plays itself if you do it right. Horenstein doesn't. Another performance I do not recommend, I really don't, is Harbourfront Carrion with the Berlin Philharmonic. It's not stiff, it's just boring and colorless. And I have a little problem with the sort of subtext for this whole recording. Carrion and Furtwängler hated each other, really hated each other. And Carrion, of course, conducted no Hindemith, other than this recording of Mathis der Maler in the 50s, just after he took over. And I have my sneaking suspicion that the reason he did it was to sort of poke at the memory of Furtwängler, who obviously had an issue with it back in the 30s, and to kind of, twist the knife. It's not a particularly well played, well recorded performance at all. It has nothing positive going for it. I don't think Carrion was particularly committed. I think he wanted to make a statement, particularly given his own Nazi past, and doing Mathis der Maler, which had caused such a stir back in the Nazi days, was kind of a subtle way, or maybe a not so subtle way. I don't know what people back in the 50s thought about it, but it was a way for him to make a statement, and it's not a musical statement in my view. So I would just avoid the Carrion. I mean, it comes in a box, you can ignore it. You don't buy it separately, and that's that. Now, let's talk about the good ones, shall we? And there are a lot of them, and I'm not going to be, totally exhaustive, Ormandy did a very fine one for Columbia, except for an added cymbal roll at the end of the first movement on the last chord. He couldn't resist because it happens on the last chord of the finale, so he figured, well, why not do it both? No, it's not what Hindemith wrote. Anyway, here we go. Herbert Blomstedt, San Francisco. This 3-disc Hindemith set is fantastic. It's divided between San Francisco Symphony and the Gewandhaus Orchestra. The performance of Mathis is wonderfully flowing and light and unstuffy as Blomstedt always was. There are recordings of this that come out of East Germany, and from the 60s and 70s, and they are so clotted. Oh my God, it's stodgy and awful. This is beautiful, and it's just lovely, and it's nicely recorded, and the whole set is one of the essential sets of Hindemith orchestral music that you really have to own if you can still get it. Also really, really fine, and this is a surprise because it's not an orchestra associated with Hindemith. Paul Kletzky with the Orchestre de la Suisse Romande on Decca. First rate all the way, beautifully recorded, beautifully interpreted. Again, I can't get into the details of interpretation so much because there really aren't that many to deal with. I suppose if somebody really trudges through like the central sex scene in the finale. Yeah, it's like a seduction scene, supposedly. It's supposed to be yummy romantic harmony that's supposed to be seducing Mathis to, abandon his mission, to finish the Isenheim altarpiece. But, these things tend to take care of themselves. Hindemith did not allow for a lot of latitude, and so I don't worry about it. Another really good one, and this one no one ever paid any attention to, but it was wonderful, was Yo Levy in Atlanta on Telarc. This has been out of print for a long time. Maybe it's back, but this contains Mathis der Maler, Nobilissima Visione, and the Symphonic Metamorphosis in very, very fine performances. Perhaps a little staid. They may be a little straight-laced. It could maybe go a little more swiftly in a couple of places, but beautiful performances, beautiful sound, a pleasure to listen to. Also, equally fabulous is this new recording on BIS and SACD with John Neschling and the Sao Paulo Symphony. It's got exactly the same coupling as the Levy, and the performances are wonderful. They swing, they're brilliant, they're exciting, they're wonderfully recorded. There is nothing not to love at all, anywhere. Also first rate, Leonard Bernstein with the Israel Philharmonic. Now this has the concert music for strings and brass, which Bernstein also recorded earlier, as did Ormandy and a lot of other people. The Symphonic Metamorphosis and Mathis der Maler. This is with the Israel Philharmonic. And again, it's absolutely first rate. The sound is actually pretty good for that venue, which was always a little dry. Hindemith's music benefits from being a little dry because it is a little dry. Let's not kid ourselves. And it's a wonderful recording. Of course, it's in the big Bernstein boxes, whichever ones you find, but it's worth looking for separately because it's a superb Hindemith disc. And Bernstein, of course, played Hindemith his entire career. He was an incredibly powerful and compelling interpreter, such as it is with Hindemith, of Hindemith's music. However, when we get to the end, there are two that we absolutely have to have, or one of two, they are by the same guy, William Steinberg. And I'm sure you knew this was coming too. Steinberg recorded Mathis der Maler twice, once in Pittsburgh with EMI and once for DG in Boston. One of his three Boston recordings for DG. One was Zarathustra and the other was The Planets. And then there was this Hindemith disc that had Mathis der Maler and the concert music. Now, the concert music was a Boston Symphony commission, so they knew it by heart. And the Hindemith was a Steinberg specialty. Nobody played it better. And it was a question of pacing. Pacing it just fabulously and getting the orchestra to play as beautifully and with as much clarity and sensitivity as humanly possible. the first movement has a lot of fugal textures and things. There are some intricacies that require some balancing and whatnot. No one does it better. The sound on this disc was always terrific. It's a magnificent, magnificent disc, probably one of the tiny handful of greatest Hindemith discs ever made. This one was always coupled with the Barenboim der Schwanendreher, the viola concerto, and which is also quite beautiful. But for the Mathis symphony and concert music, Steinberg is your guy. That performance, by the way, is also available in the big Boston Symphony DG box. But if you can find this Eloquence issue, grab it while you can. Steinberg's stuff does not seem to survive long in the catalog, and he was a wonderful, wonderful conductor who never, he should have gotten the Boston Symphony Orchestra. Instead, they gave it to Leinsdorf at the urging of RCA because he had the recording contract and Steinberg did not. And that was a crime, folks, just a crime. So we have to cherish whatever we have of Steinberg. And this Mathis der Maler is the one to get if you're having only one. So that is the story of Mathis der Maler. Thank you all very much. Keep on listening. And if you enjoyed this chat, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Bye-bye.